The rule didn't fail. It killed them. In January 1943, the U.S. Army followed its regulations perfectly on Guadalcanal. Standard rifles approved doctrine, proper discipline, and in just 72 hours, 14 American soldiers died because of it. This is the uncomfortable paradox no one likes to admit. The rule that kept armies efficient in Europe became lethal in the jungle. What was designed to maintain order quietly prevented survival. The army believed standardization saved lives. They believed unauthorized weapons created chaos. Japanese snipers weren't winning because they were better marksmen. They were winning because the environment rewrote the rules. Dense canopy, erased visibility, humidity crippled optics. Elevated positions turned textbook sniping doctrine into a trap. The jungle didn't reward patience. Inside that system was a young lieutenant holding a rifle the army had banned before the war even started. A civilian hunting rifle, not because it was unsafe, not because it didn't work, but because it didn't fit the system. His officers mocked it. Reconnaissance rejected it. Doctrine ignored it. What followed wasn't rebellion. It wasn't heroism. It was something far more dangerous to institutions. A quiet decision to trust reality over rules. 8 seconds later, 8 enemy snipers were down, and suddenly the regulation that made perfect sense could no longer justify itself. This is not a story about a magical rifle. It's a story about belief. About what happens when an army clings to rules written for one battlefield while fighting on another. About how systems don't collapse because they are stupid, but because they are confident. And about how many men have to die before reality is finally allowed to win. If you're still watching, this story isn't about a rifle. It's about what happens when rules stop protecting soldiers. Subscribe if you want real World War II stories that history prefers to soften. Guadalcanal was never supposed to be fought like this. American doctrine in early 1943 was built on lessons learned elsewhere. On open ground with clear sight lines and predictable engagement. Rifles were uniform, training was repeatable, doctrine was enforceable. Every man knew his role, and every weapon fit neatly into the system designed to support it. The jungle erased all of that in a matter of days. Point Cruz sat on the western edge of Guadalcanal, a deceptively quiet stretch of coconut groves and broken ground that concealed far more than it revealed. From a distance it looked manageable. From inside it was a trap. Visibility collapsed. Light fractured through overlapping layers of leaves. Sound traveled unpredictably. Every movement announced itself. Every pause invited death. By January 1943, American units operating near Point Cruz had learned a brutal lesson. This was not a battlefield where initiative was rewarded. Japanese snipers understood this environment in a way American doctrine did not. They did not move constantly. They did not seek repeated engagements. They tied themselves into the tops of coconut palms, 40 to 60 feet above the ground, surrendering mobility, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. One shot, one kill. Patrol leaders began to notice the pattern. A single crack from nowhere, a man collapsing without warning, no muzzle flash, no follow-up shot. Medics who rushed forward became targets themselves. Officers who tried to identify firing positions were shot next. The jungle didn't reveal the shooters. It absorbed them. Within 72 hours, 14 American soldiers lay dead in the mud around Point Cruz, not in an assault, not in a firefight. In fragments, 1 here, 2 there, enough to shatter confidence without cheering a full response. The battalion had sniper rifles. The M1903-04 Springfield was the Army's designated sniper weapon, bolt action. So inaccurate under controlled conditions, it had performed adequately in training and in European environments where visibility allowed shooters to identify targets before they disappeared. Guadalcanal was not Europe. High relief forced shooters into uncomfortable positions, amplifying recoil and slowing follow-up shots. Dense foliage turned identification into guesswork. And worst of all, the doctrine attached to the rifle assumed time. Time to observe. Time to fire once. Time to repetition. If one American shooter exposed himself after a kill, a second sniper fired from another tree. The Army's methodical approach, designed to conserve ammunition and avoid unnecessary risk, became a liability. The jungle punished hesitation and rewarded aggression. Artillery could level the groves, but it would destroy terrain. The Americans needed to advance through. Flamethrowers could burn the trees, but fuel was limited and the area too large. Bypassing the position meant leaving a lethal threat behind the lines. None of these options addressed the immediate reality. Morale deteriorated faster than casualties accumulated. Soldiers hesitated before entering the groves, not out of cowardice, but calculation. They had watched men die without seeing the enemy. They had learned that speed did not save them and caution did not protect them. The jungle offered no feedback, only consequences. Regulations forbade unauthorized weapons in combat zones for good reasons. Liganists depended on standardized ammunition. Repairs depended on known parts. Training depended on consistency. A system built for millions of soldiers could not afford individual variation. The Army's sniper doctrine assumed a duel between visible opponents. Guadalcanal presented something else entirely, a vertical battlefield, a three-dimensional problem, a space where targets were not just hidden but suspended above the ground. Blending into an environment and approved solutions, the more the situation deteriorated. Reports filtered upward describing an enemy that could not be located and a battlefield that could not be controlled. Recommends circulated advising units to avoid sniper engagements altogether. Let the enemy starve, let time solve the problem, preserve forces. But time was a luxury the campaign did not have. The American advance toward the western end of the island stalled. Japanese forces consolidated their positions. Every day spent immobilized at Point Cruz delayed the broader offensive. The cost of inaction began to outweigh the risks of confrontation. This was the moment when the rules stopped offering protection and started imposing limits. Inside this paralysis stood junior officers and enlisted men who understood the terrain better than the doctrine written for it. They had watched the failures up close. They had felt the consequences of decisions made far from the jungle canopy. And among them was one young lieutenant who had arrived on Guadalcanal with something the Army had told him not to bring, not because it was unsafe, not because it was ineffective, but because it did not belong. At this stage, no one was thinking about legacy, no one was amapted. The only question that mattered was simpler and far more immediate. How many more men would die before the system admitted it was wrong? The regulation banning unauthorized weapons did not exist by accident. It was born from experience, from chaos, from wars where improvisation had caused as many problems as it solved. Armies learned the hard way that uncontrolled variation destroyed supply chains, confused training, and fractured command. In Europe, this logic worked. Battlefields there rewarded visibility, coordination, and predictable engagement. Distances, infantry units advanced with artillery support, clear lines of sight, and defined fronts, sniping in gas, unfolded varas. Weapons like the M1903A4 Springfield fit that environment. Bolt-action rifles encouraged deliberate fire. Scopes were sufficient when humidity was manageable. And sight lines extended hundreds of yards. The doctrine emphasized patience, discipline, and ammunition conservation. It was a pressure cooker. The jungle inverted every assumption. The doctrine depended on engagement distances, shrank unpredictably. Visibility fluctuated by the minute. The enemy was not advancing across terrain. He was embedded within it. Japanese sniper doctrine evolved specifically for this environment. They relied on endurance. By tying themselves into palm trees, they accepted immobility in exchange for concealment. They carried minimal supplies, enough water, enough rice, enough patience to wait days. If necessary, American doctrine treated them as psychological weapons. The objective was not just to kill, it was to paralyze. By firing infrequently and unpredictably, Japanese snipers denied Americans the feedback they needed to respond. There was no pattern to exploit, no sustained fire to locate. Every casualty felt isolated and random, even when it was part of a deliberate design. Designated marksmen were assigned to counter sniper roles using approved rifles and approved tactics. They scanned the canopy methodically. When he fired, they fired once. When they missed, they were dead seconds later. Automatic weapons were brought forward to suppress treetops. Ammunition vanished into leaves and shadows. Tights remained invisible. The jungle swallowed the noise and revealed nothing in return. Artillery officers suggested flattening the groves entirely. Logisticians objected. Engineers warned about delays. Commanders weighed every option against the operational timetable. Mine unacceptable. Reports describe casualties and delays, but not paralysis. On paper, units were advancing. On paper, equipment was being used correctly. On paper, regulations were being followed. In practice, soldiers were afraid to move. This was not cowardice. It was learned behavior. Men who watched medics, men who watched officers die for investigating, learned not to investigate. Initiative was punished. Obedience offered no protection either. The system could not account for fear it had unintentionally manufactured. Standardization of bent equipment compatible. Alfor. It assumed that doctrine written for one environment could be enforced everywhere with minimal adjustment. These assumptions were not foolish. They were simply incomplete. The jungle exposed what the doctrine refused to consider, that there were conditions where speed mattered more than ammunition. Conservation, where a rifle umai for precision under time pressure was more valuable than one umai for standardization. The Army did not lack intelligence. It lacked flexibility. Junior officers reported problems, upward institutional momentum, resisted deviation. Allowing unauthorized equipment was not a small concession. If one officer could choose his own weapon, what stopped others from doing the same? The answer, from the system's perspective, was simple. Discipline mattered more than outcomes, until outcomes became impossible to ignore. At Point Cruz, the cost of doctrinal purity was measured in bodies. 14 men dead in 3 days was not an anomaly. It was a warning one. The system struggled to interpret. The irony was brutal. The Army possessed the technical knowledge to solve the problem. It had experienced marksmen. It had ammunition that could support them. What it lacked was permission. Permission to admit that a rule designed for efficiency had become an obstacle to survival. Within this tension stood a young lieutenant who had spent months watching approved solutions fail. He had watched regulation limit options while casualties accumulated. And he carried with him a rifle that existed entirely outside the system. Not as a statement, not as a protest, but as an insurance policy against a reality the Army was not prepared to face at this stage. No one believed that rifle would change doctrine. No one imagined it would influence future wars. The debate was narrower and far more uncomfortable. Was it better to follow a rule that no longer worked, or to break it and accept the consequences? The Army had an answer, the jungle had another, and soon one officer would be forced to choose between them. John George was not supposed to matter. The Army did not design its doctrine around individuals. It designed it around averages, around repeatable outcomes, around the assumption that any trained soldier could perform adequately with standardized equipment. But it was never meant to override structure. He was young, recently commissioned, and unremarkable on paper. He had no combat record worth noting, no reputation inside the unit, no authority to challenge doctrine or influence policy. In any other situation, he would have remained anonymous, another junior officer navigating. What made George dangerous to the system was not arrogance. It was preparation. Long before Guadalcanal, before the jungle exposed the cracks in American doctrine, George had spent years doing something the Army did not know how to quantify. He trained for precision under pressure. Combative shooting had taught him to treat marksmanship not as patience but as speed married to control, target transitions, wind judgment, muscular memory under time constraints. This was not how military sniping was taught. Army doctrine emphasized restraint, fire discipline, observation. It assumed time was available. George's experience assumed the opposite. That speed, when paired with accuracy, was survival. It was built for civilian marksmen who demanded consistency. A free-floating barrel, a smooth bolt, a trigger that broke cleanly without surprise, paired with a scope designed to endure harsh environments, it offered something the issued rifles did not: reliability under conditions where theory collapsed. He carried it because he trusted it. That trust put him in direct conflict with the institution. He served officers mocked the rifle openly. They called it a toy, a mail-order mistake, a liability. Regulations backed them. Civilian weapons were unauthorized, non-standard equipped. The Army would not replace it. If it malfunctioned, responsibility fell entirely on the user. George understood all of that. He accepted the risk. What he could not accept was watching approved solutions fail while an alternative sat unused. By the time casualties mounted at Point Cruz, George had already observed concealment. It was tempo. Japanese snipers were not winning because they were invisible. They were winning because they controlled the pace of engagement. They dictated when shots were fired and forced Americans to react. George knew how to break that rhythm. Competition shooting taught him to think in sequences rather than moments. Fire, shift, fire again, not randomly, deliberately, faster than an opponent could process. This was not doctrine. It was instinct, refined by repetition. As patrols stalled and fear spread through the unit, George reached a conclusion that few others were willing to articulate. Approaching his superiors was not an act of defiance. It was an act of desperation. George did not argue ideally. He argued results. He pointed to months of failed counter-sniper efforts, to hundreds of rounds fired with no confirmed kills, to men refusing to enter the groves because they no longer believed survival was possible. He did not promise miracles. He asked for a chance. The response he received was predictable. Regulations were cited. Supply concerns raised, precedent feared. If one officer ignored equipment rules, discipline would erode, control would weaken. The Army would become a collection of individuals rather than a coherent force. He did not ask permission to break the rules. He asked permission to be accountable for breaking them. If the rifle failed, the responsibility was his. If the mission failed, the consequences were his. If nothing changed, he would surrender the weapon and accept punishment. What made this moment decisive? 14 men were already dead. The advance had stalled. Commanders were under pressure to produce results. The cost of inaction was becoming visible, measurable, and impossible to ignore. Reluctantly, permission was granted, not as endorsement, as a gamble. One patrol, one attempt, no excuses. George entered the point, a challenge to doctrine framed as a last resort. His spotter watched the canopy while George applied a method no training manual had prepared the Army to accept. He did not wait for muzzle flashes. He did not seek perfect shots. He looked for anomalies, shapes that didn't belong, patterns that broke the jungle's rhythm. When he fired decisively. And when he shifted targets, he did so without hesitation. By the end of the first day, the impossible had happened. Japanese snipers were dead, confirmed, not suppressed. Eliminated, the system took notice. Men who had mocked the rifle now watched in silence. Reports moved upward faster than regulation could restrain them, but the system was not ready to surrender. Success created a new problem. If George was right, then doctrine was wrong, and institutions do not admit that easily. Meetings were called, objections raised, the same arguments resurfaced. Discipline, logistic. George stood at the center of it, not as a rebel but as evidence. The debate was no longer theoretical, it was operational. How many results justify breaking a rule? How many lives outweighed regulation? And how long could the Army pretend that what was working was not allowed? The answer would come not from policy but from the jungle. Because George was not finished, and the system had not yet seen what reality looked like when it stopped asking for permission. Success did not end the argument. It sharpened it. The first confirmed kills at Point Cruz spread through the battalion faster than any official report. Soldiers whispered. Officers recalculated. What had been dismissed as an irresponsible gamble now demanded explanation, not because it violated regulation, Institutions tolerate failure more easily than unauthorized success. Failure can be explained. It can be blamed on conditions, on the enemy, on bad luck. Success achieved outside the rules exposes something far worse, that the rules themselves may be wrong. Within hours, George was summoned away from the groves and into a command tent crowded with men who had not fired a shot. Battalion staff, ordnance officers, liaison officers tasked with enforcing standardization. Each represented a different pillar of the system, and each had something to lose. The questions came quickly. What would happen if it broke? There were no spare parts. What precedent did this set? An uncomfortable one. No one asked how many Japanese snipers were dead. They already knew. What they wanted to know was whether the army could afford to acknowledge it. The debate was not about marksmanship. It was about control. Standardization was the backbone of modern warfare. Supply chains depended on it. Training pipeline relied on it. Authority flowed from it. If one officer could bypass that structure and succeed, the logic holding the system together weakened. George did not argue philosophy. He argued arithmetic. How many men had advanced through the groves without taking fire? He spoke plainly, without triumph. He treated the rifle not as a miracle, but as a tool matched correctly to the environment. The numbers were undeniable. 12 rounds, 5 confirmed kills, zeroing his operation. The room fell quiet. Then the objections resumed. What if every officer decided to bring his own weapon? What if ammunition supply collapsed? What if discipline eroded? The answers did not matter. The reality outside the tent did. 14 men had already died, following the rules. The advance had stalled. And now, for the first time, there was proof that the situation could be reversed. The battalion commander understood something the others did not. This was no longer a theoretical debate. It was a countdown. Every hour spent arguing was an hour the enemy adapted. He made the decision the system had been avoiding. Not because regulations changed, not because doctrine was rewritten, but because results demanded it. The authorization was narrow, temporary, and conditional. One mission, limited duration, clear objectives. If George failed, the rifle would be confiscated, and the experiment would end. It was not an endorsement. George returned to the groves with permission he did not want and responsibility. He could not escape the weight of the decision settled in. If he failed now, it would not just confirm the army's doubts, it would validate the belief that deviation was dangerous. The jungle did not care about that burden. Japanese snipers had adjusted. They were no longer operating casually. Assists shifted, shots became rarer. Silence stretched longer. The enemy understood. Something had changed. George adapted faster. He abandoned the assumption that snipers would reveal themselves. Instead, he hunted patterns. He treated the canopy as a puzzle rather than a hiding place. Each engagement compressed time, fire, shift fire, again not recklessly but decisively. The rifle allowed transitions. The issued weapons could not. The environment rewarded speed paired with accuracy. A calculated move designed to draw medics and multiply casualties. It was a tactic perfected over months. George recognized it instantly. He did not rush to the wounded man. He searched for the follow-up shot for the second sniper coming. It confirmed his assumption: 2 targets, 2 positions, seconds to respond. George did not hesitate. The first shot broke cleanly. The second followed almost immediately. 8 seconds separated the kills. The jungle fell silent again. It was not the speed that mattered. It was what the speed represented. The doctrine had assumed patience was safety. By the end of the operation, the sniper network at Point Cruz had collapsed. Some were killed. Others fled. The paralysis that had frozen the battalion lifted almost overnight. Patrols advanced. Positions were secured. The offensive resumed. The system had its outcome, but outcomes carry consequences. The army could not unsee what had happened. It could not dismiss the results as luck or coincidence. The rifle worked, the method worked, the environment demanded it. What began as an exception became an embarrassment, because if one unauthorized rifle could change the course of a stalled offensive, it was belief. Belief that uniformity was always superior. Belief that doctrine was universally applicable. belief that rules protected soldiers regardless of context. Point Cruz proved otherwise. The rule had been broken not by rebellion, but by necessity, and once broken it could never be fully repaired. It was how long it would take, and how many men would die before adaptation became official. By the time the final engagement unfolded, Point Cruz no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a test. The Japanese snipers who remained understood the shift immediately. The silence in the groves was different now, not cautious, calculated. They were no longer hunting freely, they were being hunted. This was not the environment American doctrine had prepared for, but it was one George recognized instinctively. Competitive shooting had taught him that pressure changed behavior. Dots rushed, mistakes appeared. The moment an opponent sensed danger, discipline eroded. The jungle magnified those errors. The trap was deliberate. A single Japanese shot rang out, striking an American scout and wounding him rather than killing him. It was a textbook tactic perfected over months. Air free, draw the medic, kill the rescuer, multiply casualties. Most units had learned to fear this moment. George saw it for what it was. A signal. He did not move toward the wounded man. He slowed his breathing and widened his search. This was no longer about spotting a sniper. It was about anticipating coordination. One shooter never acted alone. There would be coverage. There would be overlap. Seconds passed. Then the second shot cracked past his position, close enough to confirm what he already knew. This was the moment Doctrine failed entirely. The manuals taught patience, wait, observe, confirm, engage carefully in the jungle. Those steps consumed the only resource that mattered: time. George did not wait. The first shot came almost immediately, clean, control. 8 seconds separated the two impacts. It was not the speed that stunned observers. It was the certainty, the decisiveness, the absence of hesitation. The environment had demanded a response faster than the doctrine allowed, and George had delivered it without compromise. When the jungle went quiet again, something fundamental had changed. Not avoided, eliminated over the next hours. No more shots came from the canopy. Patrols advanced cautiously at first, then with confidence. Medics moved without fear. Officers stepped forward without being targeted. The paralysis lifted as quickly as it had formed. 0 American casualties during George's counter-sniper operations. The 14 men killed before his mission were the last. The Army did not celebrate. Institutions rarely do when evidence contradicts belief. Reports moved upward through command channels, stripped of emotion and reduced to numbers, efficiency radios. But the implications were unavoidable. The engagement at Point Cruz demonstrated something Doctrine could no longer deny: that standardization, while essential at scale, could not replace adaptability. That rules written for one battlefield could become liabilities on another. Most uncomfortably, it showed that the system had possessed the solution all along and refused to use it. The rifle was not magical, it was appropriate. The method was not reckless, it was responsive. What made the moment dangerous was not the 8 seconds themselves, it was what they represented: a collapse of certainty, proof that discipline without context was no longer discipline. It was rigidity, not through official doctrine, but through observation. Marines took note, marksmanship instructors took note. Officers began asking different questions. Not, "Is this authorized?" but, "Does this work here?" That shift was irreversible. Within months, civilian hunting rifles. Not officially at first. Then with increasing acceptance, training adapted. Equipment lists changed. The Army and Marine Corps began to recognize what Point Cruz had already proven. The environment was in charge now. What followed was not an admission of error. Bureaucracies rarely offer that. Instead, it was a gradual rewriting of reality. New recommenced without acknowledging the pressure that forced it. The 8 seconds at Point Cruz became a reference point. Not for heroism, but for consequence. They marked the moment when a belief lost its authority. The belief that rules were universal. The belief that doctrine was immune to terrain. The belief that deviation was always dangerous. Those ideas did not disappear. They evolved. And like all evolution driven by crisis, It came at a cost. 14 men had already died before the system adjusted. Their names never appeared in reports about doctrine reform. Their deaths were recorded, filed, and moved past. The army advanced. Guadalcanal fell. The campaign continued. But the question left behind did not fade. If reality could break the rules in 8 seconds, how many battles had been lost before anyone noticed? The army moved on quickly. Once Point Cruz was secured, attention shifted west. Maps were redrawn, timetables resumed. Guadalcanal was declared operationally stable, and higher command focused on the next phase of the campaign. Official histories recorded the advance, the objectives achieved, the enemy compressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter. What they did not emphasize was how fragile that progress had been. The counter-sniper success at Point Cruz did not trigger a press release. There were no formal commendations tied to doctrine failure, no acknowledgement that regulations had delayed adaptations. The system absorbed the outcome quietly, the way institutions often do when correction threatens credibility. In reports, the language was careful: improved counter-sniper effectiveness, assessed tactics based on terrain, successful neutralization of enemy positions. No mention of unauthorized weapons had failed. No recognition that the solution had existed outside regulation. The army did not lie, it simply chose what to remember. He was not celebrated as a revolutionary. He was not elevated as a model to emulate. His actions were treated as situational, useful only within the narrow confines of a unique problem. This framing protected the institution. Doctrine remained intact, yet exceptions have a way of spreading. Officers who had witnessed the results did not forget them. Marines passing through the sector asked questions. Marksmanship instructors compared notes. Word traveled laterally, not vertically, not through shared experience. This was how real change began. Sniper training units started re-examining assumptions. The emphasis on slow, deliberate fire gave way to discussions about tempo. Ivernia, that patience was always superior, began to erode. Equipment followed the same pattern. The Winchester Model 70 did not become standard overnight. There was no sudden reversal of policy. Instead, it appeared quietly in sniper work, where commandages were practical, not theoretical. Real ability, accuracy under pressure. Performance in conditions where military-issued optics failed. The system resisted labeling. This a lesson learned. Doing so would require admitting that doctrine had lagged reality. Instead, the change was framed as evolution. Human improvement. Refinement. This distinction mattered internally. Instinctions survived by controlni. Framing change as extraordinary. The army chose the latter. George's role faded into the background. He did not push for recognition. He did not campaign for reform. He returned to operational duty, later volunteering for one of the most demanding units in the theater. Merrill's Marauders, long-range penetration missions through Burma. Terrain even less forgiving than Guadalcanal. George brought the same rifle, the same methods, the same refusal to assume that doctrine knew better than experience, and once again the results spoke quietly. Confirmed kills, successful patrols, survivability where losses had once been expected. But this time no one argued. After the war, the pattern continued. George wrote his memoir, Shots Fired in Anger, not as a victory lap, but as a technical analysis. It was blunt, unsentimental, critical of equipment and training where criticism was earned. He praised what worked and dissected what didn't. He treated warfare as a problem to be understood. The book circulated where official manuals could not, among instructors, among experienced soldiers, among those who had learned that reality often punished blind obedience. Its influence was indirect, but enduring. By the time the United States entered later conflicts, the lessons of Point Cruz were no longer controversial. Civilian-derived rifles became accepted tools. Eventually, purpose-built sniper weapons replaced both hunting rifles, and earlier molded, the system survived. What did not change was how the story was told. John George did not become a household name. His obituary mentioned his service briefly. There were no headlines connecting his actions to modern sniper doctrine. No official acknowledgement that his refusal to abandon a banned rifle had saved lives before the rules caught up. This was not an oversight. It was a choice celebrating George would require confronting the uncomfortable truth that institutions often lag behind the environments they operate in. That adaptation frequently comes from the margins, not the center. The Army preferred a cleaner lesson, one that emphasized progress without highlighting resistance. Yet the legacy endured whether acknowledged or not. Every sniper trained to think beyond the manual, every instructor who emphasized terrain over theory, every commander who allowed flexibility when the environment demanded it. They were all inheriting something forged at Point Cruz. Not a rifle, not a technique, but a realization that discipline without context is not discipline, that rules are tools, not truths, and that sometimes survival depends on recognizing when obedience has stopped being useful. The system moved forward, but the deeper lesson remained quietly embedded in the doctrine that followed. Reality always wins. The only question is how long it takes the rules to admit it. The Army eventually changed. That part is easy to accept. Doctrine evolved, equipment improved, training adapted to environments rather than forcing environments to submit to theory. By later wars, the idea that one set of rules fit every battlefield had quietly disappeared. Rules are written to save lives. They are enforced to maintain order. They exist because chaos kills. And yet on Guadalcanal, those same rules created a different kind of danger. Not sudden, not dramatic, but cumulative. Each delay, each refusal to adapt added weight until something broke. 14 men died before that break happened. They did not die because the Army was incompetent. They died because the Army was confident. Confident that discipline outweighed improvisation. Confident that doctrine traveled well across continents. Confident that regulation could antistomie exposed its limits. The rifle he carried was never the point. Had it jammed, broken, or failed, the experiment would have ended quietly, reinforcing existing beliefs. Instead, it worked, not because it was superior in all contexts, but because it was superior in that one. That distinction mattered, and it remains uncomfortable. Military institutions. They cannot operate if every individual decides the rules no longer apply, yet they also fail when rules become untouchable. When adaptation is treated as insubordination rather than necessity. Point Cruz sits in that narrow space between order and flexibility. It reminds us that innovation rarely enters institutions politely. It arrives under pressure, often through people with no authority to introduce it. People who are forced to choose between compliance and consequence. George never argued that rules were useless. He demonstrated that they were incomplete. That difference is subtle, and it is easy to miss. After the war, the Army incorporated the lessons without confronting the cost. Manuals were updated. Training adjusted. New weapons adopted. The institution survived stronger. For it, the men who died before adaptation took hold were never part of that narrative. Their absence is the quiet price of institutional learning. This pattern did not end with World War II. Encounter environments they did not anticipate. Whenever regulations designed to prevent failure become obstacles to survival. Whenever adherence to belief delays acknowledgement of reality. The jungle simply made the contradiction impossible. Not because he was defiant, but because he was observant. He recognized when theory no longer matched conditions, when discipline stopped protecting and started endangering. His decision was not heroic in the traditional sense. It was pragmatic. He trusted what he could measure over what he was told to believe. That choice saved lives, and it forced change. Yet even today, the paradox remains unresolved. Rules are still written far from the environments they govern. Doctrine is still built on assumptions that hold until they don't. Institutions still prefer stability to adaptation, until stability becomes liability. Point Cruz was not unique. It was simply clear a moment where reality demanded a response faster than belief could adjust. The Army learned, history moved on. How many systems are still waiting for their Point Cruz? How many rules still make sense until suddenly they don't? And how many lives are lost before adaptation becomes acceptable? John George never framed his actions as a lesson. He described them as necessity. The jungle did not give him time to debate philosophy. It demanded a result. That may be the most enduring truth of all. Reality does not negotiate with belief. It does not respect intention. And it does not wait for permission. It simply reveals what works and what doesn't. The only variable is how long it takes us to accept the answer. History remembers victories. It forgets the rules that failed first. Subscribe for more Forgotten World War II, decisions that quietly changed how wars are fought.